think you're looking at a barren mound of earth stone towers rising out of a valley empty inside? But no, this is Iran. And inside those stone towers, people are still cooking dinner tonight, just as they have done every night for the past 11,000 years. The place you're used to seeing through headlines about politics and conflict still hides an entirely different rhythm of life, quiet, resilient, and older than anything you might imagine. Villages carved and molded directly into volcanic cliffs by the rough, calloused hands of men across hundreds of generations. Paths barely wide enough for a single person to pass. Doorways so low you must bow each time you step inside, and people still whisper that this may be where the legend of the dwarf tribes in the region's oldest tales first began. This is an image of Iran completely at odds with the Iran you see in the news. No conflict, no politics. Just people repairing the walls their great-grandfathers built, crawling into the rock alcoves their ancestors carved, lighting fires on the very same hearths that burned in that exact spot 11,000 years ago. A way of life built onto the stone, carved into it, climbed across it, and tucked within it, day after day, generation after generation, without interruption. Welcome to an Iran you have never seen, where time does not move forward, but seeps slowly into every layer of rock, every trace of soot, every small pair of hands rebuilding the wall their great-grandfather once built. Unreal Iran. Rising from the volcanic foothills of Mount Sahand in northwestern Iran, roughly 40 miles south of Tabriz. Thousands of years of lava flows and ash deposits hardened into tuff, which wind and rain then carved into towering cone formations. Some rising more than 30 feet from the valley floor, others clustering in irregular rows along the hillside, their surfaces shifting from pale ochre at midday to deep amber at dusk. Inside these cones, families have organized entire domestic lives within walls nearly 6 feet thick. In the early morning, smoke rises from the uppermost openings of the rock, spires as women light coal fires to boil water. The sound of copper kettles and low conversation carrying between adjacent cones before the valley fully wakes. Children move between chambers along narrow interior passages, their footsteps absorbed by stone. Elderly residents sit at carved rock doorways, watching the light change on the opposite hillside, a view their grandparents watched from the same threshold. The kitchen, inside a Khandovan cone, is inseparable from the architecture itself. The hearth cut directly into the stone floor, the cooking pot resting in the same depression, worn smooth by generations of the same gesture. Tea is prepared on coal embers in copper vessels that have never left the cave, served in small glasses, held with both hands against the cold that seeps through even the thickest tough walls in winter. The ceiling above every hearth carries decades of blackened soot. Not as evidence of neglect, but as the accumulated record of every meal ever cooked within that particular cone, a domestic archive written in smoke rather than ink. Today, younger families weigh the friction between this unmatched insulation and the absence of running water on upper levels. A tension that no volcanic architecture has yet resolved. On the eastern face of the Alborz Range, where humid air from the Caspian Sea meets the steep northern slopes of Iran's greatest mountain barrier. Masuliye occupies a gradient so extreme that conventional architecture became impossible. Built along a hillside inclined at nearly 60 degrees and sitting roughly 3,700 feet above sea level, the village rises in stacked tiers. Each household's roof forming the street-level ground of the household immediately above it. On any given morning, the rooftop pathways carry the full texture of village life simultaneously. A woman hanging laundry beside the chimney stack of the family below her. Two men negotiating the price of something over a shared wall. A child running the full length of a neighbor's roof as though it were a dedicated playground, which, functionally, it is. Grandmothers in layered skirts embroider by doorways, while the fog moves through the alleyways below at eye level. The kitchen defines the rhythm of the Masuliye day more than any clock or prayer call. By mid-morning, the smell of ash, a long-simmered soup of wild herbs, spinach, lentils, and handmade noodles. Has moved through every narrow corridor of the village, rising with the steam through open doorways and dispersing into the cold Alborz air. Ash is not a recipe here, so much as a daily act of maintenance. A meal that requires hours of attention over wood, fire, and rewards that attention with a warmth that the stone walls absorb and return slowly through the night. Women still speak Gilaki among themselves while they cook. A language older than Farsi in its spoken form, passed from mother to daughter in the same narrow rooms, over the same pots, where it has always been spoken. The mountain does not interrupt daily life here. It organizes it. In the Tangivar Canyon of Iranian Kurdistan, two opposing limestone walls rise from either side of a narrow valley, with enough elevation and proximity to cast each other in partial shadow through the middle hours of the day. Palangan occupies both cliff faces simultaneously. Buildings stacked in ascending rows on each wall, a river running roughly 200 feet below, and more than 20 mineral springs descending from the rock faces above, feeding cold water channels that run through the settlement before dropping toward the canyon floor. The daily life of Palangan moves vertically in a way that life in flat places never does. A woman descending from the upper tier to collect spring water passes 3 other households in the process, pausing at each briefly the way people pause at intersections. Men returning from the fish channels in the afternoon carry trout through the same stepped passages that school children use, going the opposite direction. The cold mineral spring water that descends through Palangan has, over time, produced something ecologically improbable in this landscape. A cold water trout fishery operating at the center of an otherwise arid mountain region, fed entirely by the springs emerging from the canyon walls above the village. Trout are raised in stone-channeled runs, no wider than a doorway, harvested in the afternoon, split and pressed flat against bamboo frames, and grilled directly over open walnut wood fires on the wider terrace levels, where families gather in warm weather to eat outdoors. The smell of wood smoke and river fish moves outward and downward through the canyon air in the late afternoon. The direction of the draft carrying it toward the valley floor rather than upward, so that the entire canyon fills gradually with the evidence of the evening meal before the meal itself begins. Tea is drunk sitting at the water's edge, where the sound of the spring current is loud enough to require leaning close to be heard. A setting so acoustically particular that the ancient Kurdish sung poetry tradition called Hure, performed in the open spaces between houses, sends its voice outward against the canyon wall opposite and receives it back, slightly altered. Having briefly belonged to the mountain, before returning to the singer who first offered it. Deep in the Zagros range along Iran's western border with Iraqi Kurdistan at roughly 4,900 feet elevation. Uraman Takht rises from the canyon wall in tight, receding tiers. Each level of housing set back slightly from the one below, so the entire settlement resembles, from the valley floor, a throne carved into the face of the mountain. Walls are dry-stacked limestone without mortar, anchored by walnut wood beams, built to move slightly with the earth rather than resist it. Daily life here runs along the stepped pathways that connect every household. The same surfaces that become ceremonial ground during the winter festival of Pir Shaliar, when the village transforms into something older than its current architecture. On ordinary days, men carry firewood up stone staircases too narrow for any wheeled vehicle, while women prepare dishes in open doorways where the view extends uninterrupted into the canyon below. During the festival of Pir Shaliar, the culinary and communal converge in a way that makes the distinction between ritual and meal impossible to locate. Enormous clay pots are arranged in the open terraces between houses, filled with lamb and wild walnut and slow-cooked over communal fires. The preparation itself, a collective act, every family contributing labor rather than ingredients, the finished dish belonging to no single household. The walnut is not incidental here. The Uraman Valley produces a wild variety with a bitterness that the long cooking process slowly transforms. And the resulting flavor carries within it the specific mineral character of this particular canyon, a taste that cannot be reproduced from walnuts grown elsewhere. Families gather in the early evening on the highest terrace, where the last light lingers longest, passing small glasses between hands while the daft drums begin their call from multiple points across the stepped stone village, the community assembling itself through sound and shared heat at once. Where the last light lingers longest, passing small glasses between hands while the daft drums begin their call from multiple points across the stepped stone village. The community assembling itself through sound and shared heat at once. At nearly 7,200 feet on the slopes of the Caucasus Range in central Iran, iron oxide present in such concentration in the local clay and stone that the village becomes visually indistinguishable from its substrate at certain angles. Abiyane appears from the road below as a dense cluster of structures, the exact color of the surrounding rock. Iron oxide present in such concentration in the local clay and stone that the village becomes visually indistinguishable from its substrate at certain angles. The material hardens with rain rather than eroding, meaning every storm that has passed through this valley has reinforced the walls rather than weakened them. Inside those walls, a domestic culture of exceptional specificity has been maintained across centuries of isolation. Women here wear white headscarves printed with red roses and multi-layered skirts. A deliberate visual refusal of the black chador worn across most of Iran. And they wear them not for festivals, but for ordinary Tuesday mornings in the market square. Old men sit beside wooden doors, fitted with two separate knockers, one producing a tone for male visitors and one for female, a distinction the household has observed uninterrupted for longer than most nations have existed. The rooftops of Abiyane become, through the summer months, a second kitchen operating in slow time. Flat surfaces covered in apricots, grapes, figs, and pomegranate seeds laid out to dry in the high-altitude sun so that seen from the hillside above, the village surface becomes a dense patchwork of amber, burgundy, and gold laid across the iron-red earth base. The visual logic is inseparable from the practical one. The dried fruit will sustain the village through the mountain winter when nothing grows and nothing arrives. Tea is drunk from copper samovars fired by walnut wood charcoal, and the custom of holding a cube of rock sugar called nabat between the teeth rather than dissolving it in the glass means that the sweetness of each cup arrives gradually, carried through the heat, calibrated to the drinker rather than the drink. A small but complete philosophy of patience enacted several times each day. In the southeastern province of Kerman, where the central plateau approaches the edge of the Lut Desert, Maymand occupies a canyon wall inhabited for approximately 12,000 years. Roughly 400 hand-carved chambers, called quiche, are excavated horizontally into the sandstone cliff at varying heights. Connected by irregular paths that follow the logic of the rock rather than any human plan. Some chambers extend inward more than 30 feet, branching into multiple rooms with sleeping platforms, storage niches, and cooking areas carved directly from the surrounding stone. What fills these spaces is not emptiness preserved for tourists, but the active residue of lives still being lived. A grandmother's woolen blankets folded across a stone sleeping ledge. A blackened cooking pot resting on the same hearth depression her mother used. Children's drawings chalked onto a smooth section of cave wall beside the entrance. Families who return each winter to their ancestral quiche move through the chambers in a choreography inherited rather than learned. Each person knowing, without instruction, which niche holds the stored grain, which passage leads to the upper ventilation cut, which wall is warmest after the evening fire. The food of Maymand is built entirely around what the surrounding desert and highland can provide without cultivation. Wild pistachio, small, hard-shelled, and intensely flavored, is cracked open on flat stones outside the cave entrance. The kernels ground by hand into a paste that becomes the base of a dense, protein-rich soup called ab-benay, cooked slowly over the cave hearth until the bitterness of the raw nut converts into something deep and almost smoky. Flatbread, called nane tiri, stretched paper-thin and baked directly on a heated iron plate over coals. Is made in quantities large enough to last weeks, stacked and stored in the cool inner chambers, where the stone maintains a near constant temperature. The bread does not go stale in these conditions so much as it concentrates, becoming denser and more intensely flavored with each passing day. A food designed not for immediate pleasure, but for duration, for the long winter months, when the cave is closed against the cold and the only warmth available is what the hearth and the walls between them can hold. Roughly 12 miles from the Afghan border in South Khorasan province, in a valley so arid and remote that the landscape reads as geological rather than geographic, Makhunik was built to disappear. Structures are excavated approximately 3 feet below ground before rising above the surface, their roof lines barely higher than the surrounding terrain. Entry doors stand roughly 20 to 30 inches tall, requiring anyone entering to bow a design that simultaneously limited heat loss and slowed any unwanted passage across the threshold. Inside these low-ceilinged rooms, families have organized domestic life around a single central hearth called a kandik, which functions simultaneously as kitchen, heat source, and social center. In the evening, the entire household gathers within arm's reach of it, not by choice, but by geometry, the room offering no alternative arrangement. Children do their growing up in spaces no larger than a generous closet, developing a spatial fluency with limitation that shapes how they move through the world long after they leave. The food culture of Mahunik is perhaps the most radical expression of nutritional self-sufficiency found anywhere in Iran. The wild jujube, a small date-like fruit that grows without irrigation in the driest soils of the Eastern Plateau. Formed the caloric foundation of the village diet for centuries, dried and ground into flour, mixed with whatever grain the season permitted, shaped into dense flatbreads that required no oil, no dairy, and no supply line. A fermented yellow soup called kashk-e-zard, made from lactic acid cultured grain and dried herbs, provided the probiotic sustenance that the near absence of fresh vegetables would otherwise have denied. Older residents recall a community ethic that treated any food requiring purchase from outside the valley as a form of moral compromise. A philosophy of nutritional closure so complete that the village's food system and its architecture were in practice expressions of the same single instinct, to need as little from the outside world as possible, and to make that sufficiency beautiful. Seven settlements, 7 geographies, 7 peoples, separated by language, ethnicity, and altitude. Yet beneath their visible differences, the same logic repeats with a consistency that feels less like coincidence than like discovery. Each community, working independently across centuries and mountain ranges, arrived at the same answers to the questions the Earth kept asking. In none of these villages did human settlement attempt to override the landscape it occupied. No hillsides were leveled, no canyons rerouted, no grid imposed onto ground that refused to be flat. At Masouleh, the 60-degree incline became the structural logic of the entire settlement. At Kandovan, the volcanic cone became the room itself. At Palangan, 2 opposing cliff faces became the twin walls of a single community. The architecture did not shape the land shaped the architecture, and the architecture accepted those terms without negotiation. This is topographic symbiosis, a method of building that begins not with a blueprint, but with a patient, generational reading of what a specific slope, a specific rock, and a specific exposure to wind and sun will actually allow. The iron oxide clay of Abiyane hardens with moisture rather than dissolving in it, a counterintuitive property the village has exploited for centuries without importing a single outside technique. The volcanic tuff of Kandavan insulates against heat and cold at performance levels of modern construction in the same climate struggles to match. The dry stacked limestone of Uraman Takht absorbs seismic movement by distributing force through its joints, rather than resisting it through rigidity. The soot layered across Memon's cave ceilings is not the residue of primitive living. It is a biological composite that reinforces stone and regulates moisture. Each material was chosen not for appearance, but for behavior. What it did, under pressure, across time, was survive. In all 7 villages, the boundary between private and communal space is either blurred or functionally meaningless. The roof of one household becomes the courtyard of another. The pathway between 2 homes passes directly across a third family's living surface. The kitchen fire warming one dwelling radiates into the adjacent wall of the next. This is not an absence of personal boundary. It is a deliberate architecture of interdependence, a physical expression of the understanding that where the environment applies constant pressure, the individual household is not a viable unit of survival. Only the connected whole is resilient enough to endure what any single structure, facing the same conditions in isolation, could not withstand alone. The iron oxide clay of Abiyane hardens with moisture rather than dissolving in it, a counterintuitive property the village has exploited for centuries, without importing a single outside technique. The volcanic tuff of Kandavan insulates against heat and cold at performance levels modern construction in the same climate struggles to match. The dry stacked limestone of Uraman Takht absorbs seismic movement by distributing force through its joints, rather than resisting it through rigidity. The soot layered across Memon's cave ceilings is not the residue of primitive living. It is a biological composite that reinforces stone and regulates moisture. Each material was chosen not for appearance, but for behavior. What it did, under pressure, across time, was survive. In all 7 villages, the boundary between private and communal space is either blurred or functionally meaningless. The roof of one household becomes the courtyard of another. The pathway between 2 homes passes directly across a third family's living surface. The kitchen fire warming one dwelling radiates into the adjacent wall of the next. This is not an absence of personal boundary, it is a deliberate architecture of interdependence, a physical expression of the understanding that where the environment applies constant pressure, the individual household is not a viable unit of survival. Only the connected whole is resilient enough to endure what any single structure, facing the same conditions in isolation, could not withstand alone.